On April 6, 2026, the Orion spacecraft Integrity disappeared behind the far side of the moon. 4 astronauts on board, 0 communication with Earth. For 40 straight minutes, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen were more isolated than any human beings had been in over half a century. But here's what started flooding the internet almost immediately after. Videos claiming the Artemis II crew heard something strange back there, something eerily similar to a sound that spooked 3 NASA astronauts almost 60 years ago. A sound that was recorded, filed away, and according to dozens of viral videos, deliberately hidden from the public. So did the Artemis II crew actually hear something behind the moon? And what exactly happened back in May 1969 that made 3 of NASA's best astronauts question whether they should even tell anyone what they experienced? This is a story that starts with a whistling sound in the void of space, and it ends with one of the most persistent myths in spaceflight history. To understand what's really going on here, we need to go back to May 1969 and a mission that history has almost completely forgotten about. Apollo 10 was the dress rehearsal, 2 months before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would walk on the moon during Apollo 11. NASA sent Tom Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan on what was essentially the final test run. They would fly to the moon, enter lunar orbit, and bring the lunar module down to within about 9 miles of the surface. Everything Apollo 11 would do, minus the actual landing. The pressure was enormous. If Apollo 10 failed, the moon landing would be delayed. If the rendezvous procedures did not work, Armstrong and Aldrin could end up stranded on the lunar surface. These 3 men were carrying the weight of the entire Apollo program on their shoulders. Stafford and Cernan climbed into the lunar module, which they would nicknamed Snoopy. John Young stayed behind in the command module, Charlie Brown. And on May 22, 1969, the 2 spacecraft separated and began rehearsing the rendezvous procedures that Apollo 11 would need to pull off for real. Then both spacecraft drifted behind the far side of the moon. And this is where things get interesting, because behind the moon, you are completely cut off. The moon's entire mass, over 73 billion tons of rock, blocks every radio signal between you and Earth. Houston cannot hear you. You cannot hear Houston. If something goes wrong, nobody on Earth will know until you come back around the other side. For roughly 1 hour, you are floating above a cratered wasteland that no human eyes had seen before 1968, and you are completely, totally on your own. That's when all 3 astronauts started hearing something through their headsets. A strange, high-pitched whistling sound that rose and fell in waves, almost like a theremin, almost like music. Cernan was the first to say something about it. He described it to Stafford and Young as outer space-type music. Young asked if the others could hear it too. They could. And then the conversation took a turn that decades later would fuel conspiracy theories across the internet. Young said, and this comes directly from NASA's official mission transcript, that nobody would believe them. Cernan agreed. He said it was just like something from outer space. And then Young asked the question that changed everything. He asked whether they should tell anyone about it. Cernan's response was that they ought to think about it. Now pause on that for a second. These are 3 of the most experienced test pilots and astronauts on the planet. Men who had been through some of the most rigorous training any human being has ever undergone. And they were genuinely unsure whether to report what they were hearing to mission control. But here's the detail that gets left out of almost every viral video about this incident. In the very same conversation, literally seconds later, John Young offered a theory. He said it was probably caused by the VHF ranging system, the very high-frequency radios that both spacecraft were using to track each other's position. And Young was right. Apollo 10 was the first mission in history to fly 2 crewed spacecraft in the vicinity of the moon at the same time. Apollo 8, the mission before it, had only the command module and reported nothing unusual. With both Snoopy and Charlie Brown running their VHF transmitters and rendezvous radar systems simultaneously, the overlapping radio frequencies created interference patterns, beat frequencies, harmonics, the kind of electromagnetic feedback that, when pumped through a headset, sounds exactly like a high-pitched, eerie whistle. The astronauts weren't hearing alien transmissions. They were hearing their own equipment talking to itself. And here's the proof that NASA knew this. Before Apollo 11 launched 2 months later, the agency specifically briefed Michael Collins about the phenomenon. Collins was the command module pilot who would orbit the moon alone while Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the surface, completely alone. No other crew member within miles, just Collins, the command module, and the far side of the moon. In his 1974 memoir, Collins wrote that he heard the same strange sounds in his headset during his solo orbit. He described it as an eerie sound, but because NASA had warned him about it beforehand, he knew exactly what it was. He noted that the radio technicians had a ready explanation, and it had nothing to do with UFOs. Every subsequent Apollo mission that flew 2 crewed vehicles in lunar orbit reported similar whistling and interference. Apollo 12, Apollo 14, Apollo 15. By that point, it was just background noise, about as remarkable to the crews as the hum of an air conditioner. Nobody gave it a second thought. So if NASA figured this out in 1969, why did the story explode in 2016? And why do people still think the recordings were hidden? This is where the timeline gets messy and where a lot of well-meaning journalists got the facts wrong. The original mission tapes were stamped confidential in 1969, which sounds suspicious until you learn that this was standard procedure. NASA marked all raw crew audio as confidential because it contained unvetted conversations, personal remarks, and the occasional profanity. The classification had nothing to do with covering up mysterious sounds. By 1973, the transcripts were declassified and sitting at the National Archives, available to anyone who wanted to read them. NASA put the transcripts on their website around 2008. The actual audio files were uploaded to NASA's servers and the Internet Archive by 2012. All of this was public, searchable, and free. But nobody was paying attention to Apollo 10 audio files on the Internet Archive. That changed in February 2016, when the Science Channel aired an episode of their show, NASA's Unexplained Files. The episode featured the recordings, played them with dramatic music underneath, and framed the whole thing as an unsolved mystery. They gave the final word to Al Worden, the Apollo 15 command module pilot, who said that the Apollo 10 crew were experienced enough to know what sounds normal and what doesn't, and that if something was recorded, then something was there. The clip went viral within hours. Headlines across CNN, HuffPost, and dozens of other outlets ran with phrases like secret recordings and classified NASA audio. Social media exploded. Conspiracy forums had a field day. Within a week, the Apollo 10 sound had become one of the most discussed space stories of the decade, which is wild when you consider that the actual recordings had been sitting in a public archive for over 40 years. And the story stuck because it hit every button. A mysterious sound, the isolation of deep space, the suggestion of a government cover-up, astronauts whispering to each other about whether they should even tell anyone. You couldn't write a better hook for a conspiracy theory if you tried. But there was a problem with the framing. Several problems, actually. First, Worden never flew on Apollo 10. He was on Apollo 15, a completely different mission. He never personally heard the Apollo 10 sounds in flight. His opinion, while interesting, was speculation from someone who wasn't there. Second, Cernan, who was actually there and who first called it outer space-type music, shut the whole thing down publicly. He told reporters that the incident never excited him enough to take it seriously. He said it was probably just radio interference, and that if they had thought it was anything else, they would have briefed everyone after the flight. They never gave it another thought. NASA's own history office pushed back on social media within days of the viral moment, pointing out that the audio had been publicly available for decades and linking directly to the transcripts. Which brings us back to April of 2026 and the Artemis II mission. Artemis II had launched on April 1st from Kennedy Space Center, riding the Space Launch System, a rocket that produces 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, and mission specialists Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen were strapped into the Orion capsule they had named Integrity. It was the first crewed flight beyond low Earth orbit since Apollo 17 in 1972, over 50 years since any human had seen the moon up close. When Orion Integrity flew behind the moon on April 6th, the internet was primed for a sequel. The crew had just broken Apollo 13's distance record, traveling over 252,000 miles from Earth, and they were swooping to within about 4,000 miles of the far side's cratered surface. When the spacecraft entered that planned 40-minute communication blackout, a wave of speculation started building online. Did they hear the music? Did it happen again? Within days of splashdown on April 10th, YouTube channels started posting videos with titles about strange sounds the Artemis II crew heard behind the moon. Some of them spliced old Apollo 10 audio over footage of the Orion capsule. Others cited a speculative GB News article that had wondered, before the mission even happened, whether the crew might experience a repeat of the 1969 phenomenon. But here's what actually happened. Nothing. At least, nothing unusual. The 40 minutes of silence passed exactly as mission planners expected. Inside the capsule, the crew watched the far side of the moon scroll beneath them. A landscape that looks nothing like the near side we see from Earth. No large dark Maria, just endless craters stacked on top of craters, ancient and untouched. Christina Koch's first words when Integrity emerged from behind the moon were a standard communication check. She told Houston it was great to hear from Earth again. Jeremy Hansen described the far side as extraordinary and mentioned looking back at Earth. Koch noted that the lunar surface looked unfamiliar from that angle, that the darker patches weren't in their usual places. The crew sounded calm, professional, and quietly amazed. Not spooked. That's it. No mysterious sounds, no eerie whistling, no dramatic debates about whether to tell mission control. And when you think about it, it would have been genuinely shocking if they had heard anything. The Apollo 10 phenomenon required a very specific setup, two crewed vehicles running separate VHF radio systems in close proximity, creating electromagnetic interference. Artemis II flew a single spacecraft. Orion uses modern S-band and X-band communications with digital filtering, a completely different radio architecture than what Apollo used in the 1960s. The specific technical failure that produced the 1969 whistling simply does not have an equivalent on the Orion spacecraft. So here's where this story gets interesting, and it has nothing to do with aliens or cover-ups or secret recordings. The real story is about 3 astronauts in 1969 who heard something they couldn't explain, in the most isolated place any human had ever been, and they reacted like scientists. They noted it, discussed it, offered hypotheses, and moved on with their mission. John Young nailed the explanation in real time, sitting in a tin can behind the moon with 1960s technology because he understood his equipment. And then 57 years later, when 4 more astronauts made that same journey behind the moon for the first time since the Apollo era, the moment that actually mattered wasn't some recycled mystery. It was Christina Koch's voice cutting through 40 minutes of silence, confirming that Orion's systems worked perfectly and that humanity was back at the moon. It was Victor Glover becoming the first black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit. It was Jeremy Hansen becoming the first non-American to leave Earth's neighborhood. Those are the stories worth telling. That's the real story here. Not hidden recordings, not alien music, just engineers solving problems, pilots flying their missions, and the internet doing what the internet does. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you catch the next one.